Richard never expected to see her again, let alone like this. A woman he once loved, now homeless on the cold Chicago streets with two small children. But when their eyes met, recognition hit like a punch. And then, the real shock came. Because the truth she had hidden, it changed everything. Richard Peterson stepped out of his sleek black Mercedes, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored navy blue suit as the crisp Chicago air carried the scent of damp pavement and distant exhaust. The rhythmic pulse of the city surrounded him, horns blaring, tires screeching, conversations blending into a constant hum of movement and power. This was his world, one where control was second nature, where everything operated with efficiency, where people moved like chess pieces, and he always played to win. His watch glowed against the dimming light of the evening, a reminder that he was running late for his dinner meeting, something he rarely allowed to happen. The valet approached, a young man with eager eyes and an overly rehearsed smile. Richard barely acknowledged him as he handed over the keys, his mind already shifting to the business deal he was about to finalize. Another acquisition, another step towards solidifying his empire, another effortless victory. Yet, as he turned toward the entrance of the upscale restaurant, his stride faltered. Someone caught his eye. Across the street, a woman sat on the frozen concrete, her body curled protectively around two small children huddled against her. Her coat was tattered, sleeves too thin for the biting cold, and her long, dark hair hung in tangled strands that partially obscured her face. The children clung to her sides, their frail bodies wrapped in mismatched sweaters that barely provided warmth. Their shoes were scuffed, too small for their feet, and their cheeks were red from the wind. A half-empty paper cup sat beside them, untouched by the passing crowd. Richard wasn't sure why he stopped. Maybe it was the way she held them, the quiet desperation in her movements, the way she pressed them against her as if shielding them from a world that had long since abandoned them. Something about the scene made his chest tighten, a strange sensation he couldn't quite place. People passed by, barely sparing them a glance, as if they were nothing more than another forgotten fragment of the city's underbelly, as if their suffering was an accepted part of the landscape. A group of well-dressed patrons exited the restaurant nearby, their laughter sharp against the evening air. One woman in a crimson dress shot a glance at the beggar and her children, her lips curling in distaste before she turned away, whispering something to her companion that made him chuckle. The interaction was brief, meaningless to them, but to Richard, it felt strangely wrong. He had seen homeless people before. This was Chicago, after all. He had walked past men slumped in alleyways, seen women clutching cardboard signs near subway stations, watched countless faces blur into the periphery of his existence. He had never stopped, never thought twice. Until now, because something about her was unsettlingly familiar. His fingers clenched as he took a hesitant step forward, his gaze locked onto the woman's frail frame. The way her shoulders hunched, the shape of her jawline beneath the grime and exhaustion. Something about her stirred an uncomfortable recognition in him. He tried to place it, to dig through the memories of his past, but the answer dangled just out of reach, taunting him with a sensation he couldn't ignore. The restaurant door swung open behind him, the maitre d' calling his name. He blinked, tearing his eyes away from the woman as reality pulled him back into the present. Grant was waiting. The contract was waiting. He had no time for distractions. With a sharp inhale, he straightened his shoulders and stepped inside, allowing the warmth of the restaurant to envelop him as the scent of roasted duck and expensive wine filled the air. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over the room, illuminating patrons in tailored suits and silk dresses, people who existed in an entirely different universe from the one he had just glimpsed outside. Grant was already seated at their usual table, a glass of bourbon in hand, his expression unreadable as he watched Richard approach. "You're late," he remarked, lifting a brow. "That's not like you." Richard slid into the chair, exhaling slowly. "Got held up." Grant smirked. "Didn't peg you as the type to get distracted." Richard didn't respond, reaching for his own drink instead, the amber liquid burning his throat as he swallowed. But his mind wasn't in the restaurant, wasn't on the deal or the numbers or the carefully rehearsed negotiations that were supposed to take place. His mind was still outside, with the woman and the children pressed against her sides. He could still see them. Something gnawed at him, an unease that refused to settle. It wasn't pity. He wasn't naive enough to think he could save every struggling soul in the city. No, this was different. This was personal. His fingers tightened around the glass, and against his better judgment, he turned his head slightly, just enough to glimpse the sidewalk through the window. She was still there. And then, as if sensing his gaze, the woman lifted her head. Richard's stomach clenched, his breath stalling mid-inhale. Her eyes met his, and the world around him stopped. A familiar shade of stormy green, framed by exhaustion, but still carrying the same fire he had once known. The same eyes that had once looked at him with defiance, with trust, with something dangerously close to love. His pulse thundered in his ears, memories slamming into him like an oncoming train. Margareth, his past, his first love, the woman he had never expected to see again. The woman he had lost without ever understanding why. His grip on the glass tightened until his knuckles turned white. What the hell was she doing here? The last time he had seen her, she had been on top of the world, brilliant, driven, unstoppable. Margareth had always been a force of nature, a woman who refused to be defined by anyone but herself. How had she ended up on the streets, with 2 children clinging to her like lifelines? His mind raced for an answer, but none came. Only the crushing weight of realization, the gnawing unease that told him that whatever had happened to her in the years since they last spoke, whatever had led her to this moment, he was somehow a part of it. Richard forced himself to look away, his heart pounding with something dangerously close to panic. He had spent years mastering the art of control, of keeping his emotions locked away beneath layers of logic and precision. But this was something he hadn't prepared for. Across the table, Grant was still talking, but Richard barely heard him. His world had shifted, tilted on an axis he didn't understand, and all he knew for certain was that this night had just become something far more significant than a business deal. Because outside, on the cold Chicago pavement, sat a woman who was once everything to him. A woman he had thought he would never see again. And now, she was nothing more than a ghost of the past, a shadow of the life she was supposed to have, a puzzle that demanded to be solved. Richard didn't know why, didn't know what answers he was looking for, but one thing was certain. He wasn't leaving this restaurant without speaking to her. What would you do if you saw someone from your past in a situation like this? Would you stop? Would you walk away? Let me know in the comments. What would you have done in Richard's place? And don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more stories that challenge the heart. Richard's fingers tapped against the edge of his whiskey glass, the rhythmic sound drowned out by the low hum of conversation around him. He barely heard Grant's voice, barely registered the elegant ambience of the restaurant, the distant chime of silverware against porcelain. His mind was trapped in a place it hadn't ventured in years, tangled in memories he had buried deep beneath layers of success, power, and the carefully curated life he had built for himself. But no amount of wealth or control could erase the past when it suddenly came crashing into the present like an avalanche. Margareth. The name pulsed through his mind, each syllable laced with the weight of old regrets. He could still see her, just beyond the glass of the restaurant's large window, curled against the cold with her 2 children clinging to her sides. The image seared into his consciousness like a scar that refused to fade. He had spent years mastering the art of indifference, of moving forward without looking back, but now, faced with the undeniable reality of her presence, he felt something he hadn't expected. Guilt. Grant said something, his voice laced with amusement, but Richard didn't respond. His business partner followed his gaze toward the window, narrowing his eyes as he spotted the trio outside. "That what's got you so distracted?" Grant asked, swirling his bourbon lazily before taking a slow sip. "Some beggar on the street?" Richard's jaw tightened. "That's not just some beggar." Grant raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You know her?" Richard exhaled slowly, setting his drink down with more force than necessary. "I did. A long time ago." Grant studied him for a moment, his sharp eyes glinting with curiosity. "An ex?" Richard didn't answer. He wasn't sure how to describe what Margareth had been to him. It was easier to pretend she had simply been a part of his past, a memory that had no hold over him. But the truth was far more complicated. She had been more than just an ex. She had been his first love, the woman who had challenged him, who had made him believe, for a brief moment, that there was more to life than ambition and calculated moves. And now, she was sitting on the sidewalk, hungry, freezing, lost. Grant let out a low whistle, leaning back against the leather booth. That's rough. Wonder what happened to her. Richard wondered the same thing, but something deep inside him already knew that whatever had led Margareth to this moment, it hadn't been kind. He could still picture her as she had been back then, full of life, fire in her eyes, unstoppable in her ambition. She had always carried herself with a quiet confidence, a defiance that set her apart. Seeing her now, stripped of all of that, was like looking at a distorted version of someone he used to know, a cruel reminder that life had no mercy. He forced himself to shake off the unsettling thoughts, shifting his focus back to Grant, back to the conversation he was supposed to be having, back to the deal he was supposed to be closing. But his body betrayed him. His hands remained clenched, his pulse erratic, his mind refusing to let go. Minutes passed, or maybe an eternity, and finally, Richard couldn't take it anymore. "I'll be back," he muttered, pushing back from the table before Grant could question him. He barely registered the disapproving look his business partner shot him as he made his way toward the exit. The moment he stepped outside, the cold night air hit him like a slap, sharp and unforgiving. Margareth didn't notice him at first. She was too focused on her children, adjusting the thin fabric of their coats, her fingers trembling from the chill. The younger one, a little boy no older than 4, shivered against her side, his tiny hands clutching the hem of her sleeve. Richard's throat tightened. He took a cautious step forward. "Margareth." She froze. The name hung between them like an invisible force, pressing down on the space that separated them. Slowly, hesitantly, she lifted her head, and for the first time in over a decade, their eyes met. Recognition flickered across her face, but it wasn't immediate. Her brows furrowed, confusion shadowing her features as she studied him. And then, as if the memory of him had finally surfaced, her expression shifted. Her lips parted slightly, her body tensing, her arms instinctively wrapping tighter around the children beside her. Richard swallowed hard. He had prepared for anger, for resentment, for whatever emotion she might throw at him, but he hadn't expected the raw vulnerability in her eyes. She looked at him as if he were a ghost, as if saying his name had somehow conjured something from a life she had long since abandoned. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city faded into nothing, drowned out by the weight of the silence between them. Then, Margareth exhaled shakily, blinking as if trying to convince herself he was real. "Richard," his name on her lips sent a jolt through him, a strange mix of nostalgia and unease curling in his chest. She said it the same way she used to, soft yet firm, questioning yet knowing. But there was something else in her tone now, something broken. He nodded, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to bridge the canyon that had formed between them over the years. She let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Of course," she murmured under her breath, shaking her head. "Of course it's you." Richard's heart pounded. He had expected questions, maybe even accusations, but he hadn't expected this. This quiet resignation, this acceptance of his presence as though she had always known he would resurface eventually. He took another step forward. "Margareth, what happened?" The words felt inadequate, but they were the only ones he could manage. She flinched, as if the question had physically hurt her, as if it had reopened a wound that had never truly healed. Her gaze flickered down to her children, then back to him, her jaw tightening. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind. Richard frowned. "Margareth, No, her voice was sharper this time, edged with something dangerously close to desperation. "You don't get to show up after all these years and ask me that. You don't get to pretend like you care." Her words hit him harder than he expected. He didn't know what stung more, the bitterness in her tone or the undeniable truth in what she was saying. The younger child let out a small whimper, his fingers tightening around her coat. Margareth immediately softened, shifting her attention back to him, whispering something soothing that Richard couldn't hear. Richard ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. "I don't know what happened to you," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "But I want to." Margareth looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she let out another one of those hollow laughs, shaking her head once more. "You're too late for that," she said, pulling the children closer as she turned away from him. And just like that, she disappeared into the crowd, swallowed by the city, leaving Richard standing alone on the sidewalk, watching her walk away like she had done all those years ago. But this time, he wasn't going to let her go without answers. Richard stood there for longer than he realized, his hands buried in the pockets of his coat as Margareth and the children disappeared into the throng of people moving down the busy Chicago streets. He should have let it go. He should have turned around, gone back inside the restaurant, shaken off the momentary disturbance and focused on the life he had built, the one that had no room for ghosts of the past. But he didn't. His feet felt rooted to the pavement, his mind a whirlwind of questions that refused to settle. The way she had looked at him, there had been anger, yes, but more than that, there had been exhaustion, a deep, hollow kind of fatigue that had settled in her bones. That wasn't the Margareth he had known. That wasn't the woman who had once been so fierce, so unstoppable, the woman who had walked into a room and commanded it without saying a word. That woman had vanished, replaced by someone barely holding on. Richard turned on his heel, crossing the street in the same direction she had gone. His strides were long, purposeful, even as he told himself he had no idea what he was doing. The city was vast, the crowd thick, but he wasn't going to let her slip away again. He walked past storefronts glowing with warm, inviting light, past people laughing over steaming cups of coffee, past reminders of the life he had built, the one she had once been a part of, even if for a short time. He hadn't thought of Margareth in years, had trained himself not to, but now, with her so close, all the walls he had put up seemed to crack under the weight of memory. His eyes scanned the street, searching, and then he saw her. She had stopped a block away, standing near the entrance of a rundown building, a shelter, if he wasn't mistaken. The children clung to her, their small bodies pressed against her as she spoke quietly to them, her hands smoothing their hair, adjusting their coats, an act of comfort despite the clear distress on her face. Richard hesitated. He wasn't sure why he was doing this, wasn't sure what he even expected to come from it, but something inside him told him to move forward. So he did. Margareth sensed him before he even spoke. Her back stiffened, her shoulders squaring in a way that told him she was prepared to fight if she had to. When she turned, her expression was unreadable, but her eyes, those same green eyes that had once held so much warmth, were cold. "I told you to leave," she said, her voice calm but firm, her body positioned between him and the children, as if she were shielding them. Richard exhaled, steadying himself. "I need to talk to you." Margareth let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "Talk? After all these years, you suddenly need to talk?" She shook her head, her gaze flickering with something close to disbelief. "Go back to your world, Richard. There's nothing for you here." He ignored the sharpness in her tone, taking a careful step closer. "I don't understand. What happened to you?" She flinched at the question, a flash of something unreadable crossing her face before she quickly masked it. "Life happened," she said, her voice quieter now, almost resigned. "Not that it's any of your concern." Richard clenched his jaw, frustration simmering beneath the surface. "It is my concern. You were—" He stopped himself, exhaling sharply. "I knew you. I knew the woman you were. And now you're here, living on the streets with 2 kids, and I can't just pretend like that doesn't matter." Margaretha's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, he thought she might actually let him in, that she might say something, anything, to explain how this had happened. But instead, she looked away, her fingers tightening around the thin fabric of the children's coats. "You don't know anything, Richard," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard studied her, his gaze flickering to the children. The little girl, who looked no older than 6, was watching him with cautious curiosity, her wide brown eyes filled with questions she wasn't asking. The boy, younger, barely 4, leaned against Margaretha's leg, his face buried in her coat. Something twisted deep in Richard's gut. He didn't want to assume, didn't want to jump to conclusions, but there was something. He swallowed hard. "Are they yours?" Margareth tensed. It was barely noticeable, just a slight shift in her stance, but it was enough. Enough for Richard to realize that he had just asked the wrong question. Or maybe the right one. Her eyes met his again, colder this time, harder. "Go home, Richard," she said, turning toward the shelter. "Go back to your perfect life." She was walking away again, slipping through his fingers, but this time, he didn't let her. He reached out, catching her wrist, not tightly, not aggressively, but just enough to stop her. She froze at the contact, her breath hitching, but she didn't pull away. "Margareth," he said, softer now, no longer the businessman, no longer the man who had spent years pretending the past didn't matter. "Please." She closed her eyes for a brief moment, as if steadying herself, before slowly turning to face him again. The fight had dimmed, just slightly, but the exhaustion remained. "You want answers?" she murmured, her voice heavy. "Fine, but you won't like them." Richard didn't care. He just needed to know. Margareth exhaled slowly, then glanced toward the shelter entrance. "Not here," she muttered. "Not now." He nodded, not pushing further, but his heart pounded with something he couldn't name. Because whatever she was about to tell him, whatever truth she had been carrying for all these years, he already knew one thing for certain. It was going to change everything. Richard barely slept that night. He lay in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling, the distant sounds of the city muffled by the thick glass windows, but his mind was far from the luxury surrounding him. His world had always been built on control, on knowing his next move, anticipating every possible outcome before it even had a chance to unfold. But this was a complete blindside, a variable he had never accounted for. Margareth was here. She was homeless. She had children, and she had looked at him with an exhaustion so deep it had sent a cold shiver through him. He needed answers, but more than that, he needed to understand what had gone so wrong. Morning came, and with it, a renewed sense of urgency. He spent the day making calls, digging through the past in the only way he knew how, through facts, records, information. He started with the basics. Margareth had been one of the top students at their university, brilliant, unstoppable. She had been set for an incredible career, had offers lined up before she had even graduated. But then, she had disappeared. No job history, no academic follow-through, just vanished. It made no sense. By noon, he had his assistant, Lauren, running searches, calling old contacts, looking for any thread of her life that could explain how she had gone from one of the most promising minds he had ever known to a woman struggling to survive on the streets. By evening, he had pieces, small, fragmented, but enough to confirm what he already suspected. Something had happened to her, something that had taken everything, and Richard had a sinking feeling that he had been part of it. He arrived at the shelter just as the sun was setting, the cold air biting against his skin as he stepped out of his car. The building was old, the kind of place people avoided unless they had no other choice. He had passed places like this before without thinking twice, had never considered the lives inside, the stories hidden behind crumbling brick walls and flickering neon signs. But now, standing in front of it, knowing Margareth was in there, it felt different. It felt personal. The woman at the front desk eyed him suspiciously when he walked in, his expensive coat and polished shoes standing out against the worn-down surroundings. He wasn't supposed to be here. Men like him didn't belong in places like this. But he ignored the looks, the whispered conversations as he scanned the room. Then he saw her. Margareth sat at a small table in the corner, her back to the wall, one arm wrapped protectively around the little boy, while the girl sat beside her, scribbling on a tattered piece of paper with a broken crayon. There was something so painfully familiar in the way she held them close, in the quiet strength in her posture, that for a moment, Richard couldn't move. Then, as if sensing him, she looked up. Her expression was unreadable at first, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite place. But then, the exhaustion returned, the walls going up, the silent but clear message written across her face. Don't do this. But he already had. He walked toward her, ignoring the way she stiffened, ignoring the way she immediately reached for the children as if to pull them away. Can we talk? He asked, keeping his voice low. Margareth hesitated, glancing at the children before exhaling quietly. Not here. Richard nodded. I'll wait outside. Minutes later, she stepped out into the cold, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Though whether it was to shield against the wind or the conversation to come, he wasn't sure. She didn't look at him at first, just stood there, staring out at the street. You shouldn't be here, she finally said, her voice quieter than before. Richard exhaled slowly. You said you'd give me answers. She let out a short, hollow laugh. Right? Answers. Because that's what you came for, isn't it? Margareth, he said, his voice softer now, gentler. Please. Something in her wavered then, just for a second, but it was enough. She shook her head, sighing before finally turning to face him fully. "You want to know what happened to me?" she asked, her tone sharp. "Fine. But let's start with what happened to you, Richard. You got everything you wanted, didn't you? The business, the success, the life you always talked about. Congratulations. You won." Her words hit him harder than expected, an invisible weight pressing against his chest. "That's not what this is about," he said, his voice quieter now. "This isn't about me." "No," she scoffed. "Then why are you here? Why now? You didn't look for me all these years. You didn't care what happened to me before. So why do you care now?" Richard opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't have an answer. Margareth sighed, shaking her head. "You don't get to just walk back into my life, Richard. You don't get to ask questions when you never bothered to check in the first place." His stomach twisted. "I didn't know." Her laugh was bitter, sharp. "Of course you didn't. Because people like you don't have to know. You move forward, leave the mess behind, never look back. And I was just another part of that mess, wasn't I?" Richard clenched his jaw, frustration flickering beneath the surface. "That's not fair." "No." She arched an eyebrow. "Then tell me, Richard, where were you when everything fell apart? Where were you when I had nowhere to go? When I lost everything? When I needed—" She stopped herself, inhaling sharply before shaking her head. "It doesn't matter now. None of it does. But it did." Richard could see it in her eyes, in the way her voice trembled just slightly at the edges. It mattered, and she was still holding on to it, still carrying whatever weight had been placed on her shoulders all those years ago. He took a step closer. "Let me help you." Margareth flinched, her eyes flashing with something dangerously close to fury. "Help me." She shook her head. "You think you can fix this? That you can throw money at it and make it all go away? It's not about money." "Then what is it about, Richard?" She stared at him, her gaze burning into his. "Guilt? Pity? Because I don't need either." Richard exhaled slowly, forcing himself to meet her stare, to hold it, to let her see that he wasn't walking away this time. "It's about you." The words hung between them, thick with something unspoken, something heavier than either of them were ready to acknowledge. Margaretha's breath hitched just slightly, and for a brief second, he saw something break in her eyes, something vulnerable and raw and real. But then, just as quickly, she shut it down. "You should go," she whispered. Richard hesitated, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He had never been one to back down from a fight, had never been one to walk away from something he wanted. And right now, more than anything, he wanted to know the truth. But he also knew Margareth, and he knew when to push and when to wait. So he nodded, taking a slow step back. "I'm not giving up," he said simply. Margareth didn't respond, just turned and walked away, disappearing back into the shelter without another word. Richard stood there for a long time after, his breath visible in the cold night air, his thoughts a tangled mess of past and present colliding into something he didn't know how to untangle. But one thing was clear. He wasn't leaving this alone. Richard had always considered himself a patient man. His success had been built on precision, on the ability to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast his competition. But patience had its limits, and he was quickly discovering that Margareth tested them in ways he wasn't prepared for. She had always been stubborn, but now there was a steel in her that hadn't been there before, a guardedness that turned every conversation into a battlefield. And yet, despite her resistance, despite the wall she had built around herself, he wasn't walking away. He couldn't. The next evening, he found himself back in his office, staring at the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows, the whiskey in his glass untouched. His mind kept circling back to Margareth, to the exhaustion in her voice, to the way she had instinctively shielded her children from him, as if he were a threat. He didn't know what stung more, that she saw him that way, or that she had every right to. Lauren entered without knocking, placing a folder on his desk before crossing her arms. "You asked me to look into Margaretha's history. It wasn't easy, but I found some things you might want to see." Richard exhaled, nodding as he reached for the file. "Tell me." Lauren hesitated for a fraction of a second, and that alone told him everything he needed to know. Whatever she had found, it wasn't good. She was working for a nonprofit straight out of college, Lauren began. An organization focused on housing reform, mostly fighting against predatory development in lower-income neighborhoods. Richard tensed. He knew where this was going before she even said the words. A couple of years into her career, she went up against one of your father's companies, Lauren continued, her voice careful. She was leading a legal campaign to prevent a mass eviction in a housing complex your father's firm had acquired. Richard clenched his jaw, his fingers tightening around the edge of the folder. She lost, of course, Lauren went on, though there was no malice in her tone. The case was dismissed before it ever gained real traction, and the residents were forced out. Shortly after, she was blacklisted. No firm in the industry would hire her. She disappeared from the professional world completely. Richard felt something sink deep in his stomach, a cold, twisting weight that made it hard to breathe. He had been involved in his father's business at the time, but not on this level. He had been focused on expanding their financial empire, not paying attention to the small details of the people caught in the crossfire. But Margareth had been one of those people. Lauren exhaled, watching him closely. I don't know what happened after that. There's a gap in her records. No employment history, no listed address. Just nothing. Richard shut the folder, his jaw tight. And the children? Lauren hesitated again, and this time, she looked almost uncomfortable. There's no official record of their father. Richard stilled. You mean, there's no birth certificate on file for the boy, Lauren said carefully. I found one for the girl, but no listed father. Richard barely registered his own movement as he pushed back from his desk, standing abruptly. He didn't know what he was doing, only that he needed to get out, needed air, needed answers. Minutes later, he was driving, the city blurring past him as he made his way back to the shelter. He had spent his life making deals, negotiating terms, securing victories in rooms filled with people who wanted something from him. But Margareth? Margareth didn't want anything from him. If anything, she wanted him gone. And that meant if he wanted to help her, if he wanted to fix what had been broken, he needed to find a way in. When he arrived, she was already outside, standing near the curb with a small bag in her hands, watching the street with tired eyes. The children weren't with her. Richard stepped out of the car, approaching slowly. Where are they? Margareth barely spared him a glance. Inside, she muttered. I told you to stop showing up. Richard ignored that, his focus narrowing. Come with me. She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. Absolutely not. He exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Margareth, no. She cut him off, turning fully to face him now. You don't get to just drop back into my life and play the hero. You don't get to ask questions you didn't care about before. You don't get to act like you have any say in what happens to me. Richard stared at her, frustration bubbling beneath his carefully controlled exterior. You're struggling, he said, keeping his voice even. I can help. She scoffed. With what? A check? A nice little apartment you can throw me into so you can feel better about yourself? Richard clenched his jaw. With stability. With a real solution. Margareth shook her head, her grip tightening around the bag she held. I don't want your charity, Richard. This isn't charity, he said, his voice quieter now, more controlled. It's a deal. That made her pause. He saw it. The flicker of hesitation, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders. She sighed. I'm listening. Richard took a breath, stepping closer. You come with me. You let me help. A roof over your head. Security for the kids. No strings attached. Margareth narrowed her eyes. And what do you get? Richard met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Answers. She blinked. You tell me the truth, he continued. About what happened. About everything. No more avoiding it. No more running. Margareth looked at him for a long time, weighing his words, measuring his intentions. Then, slowly, she exhaled. 1 month, she said. That's all you get. Richard didn't hesitate. 1 month. Margareth nodded. And just like that, the deal was made. Neither of them realized, in that moment, that it would change everything. The drive was silent. Richard kept his eyes on the road, his grip firm on the steering wheel, but his mind was everywhere except on the path ahead. Margareth sat beside him, her posture rigid, her gaze fixed out the window as if refusing to acknowledge where she was, who she was with. The children sat in the back, their small forms barely visible in the reflection of the rearview mirror. The girl, quiet and reserved, looked outside as if lost in thought. The boy clutched the straps of his too-big jacket, his feet not even reaching the edge of the seat. They didn't speak. No one did. Richard had spent his entire career commanding rooms full of executives, negotiating deals worth millions, never once feeling uncertain about his next move. But now, sitting in this car with the woman who had once meant everything to him and two children he didn't understand, he felt completely out of his depth. The city lights flickered against the windshield as they moved through Chicago's streets, the tension between them growing thicker with every mile. He had brought her here because he needed answers, but now that she was in his car, now that she was about to step into his world again, he realized just how little he actually knew about her life, about what had happened since she had vanished. Margareth had agreed to a month. That was the deal. But what was a month when it came to unraveling years of silence? The building loomed ahead, a towering structure of glass and steel, cold and impersonal, a reflection of everything he had become. He pulled into the private entrance beneath the penthouse, parking in the reserved spot that had remained empty whenever he wasn't home. He turned off the engine, exhaling slowly before glancing at Margareth. She was still staring straight ahead, as if she looked at him, she'd regret whatever had led her here. "We're here," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. Margareth blinked, as if snapping out of whatever thoughts had consumed her, and finally turned her head toward the children. "Come on, let's go," she murmured. The girl unbuckled her seatbelt, her movements careful, practiced. The boy hesitated, his small hands gripping the edge of his booster seat before glancing at Richard. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at him, something that made Richard's chest tighten. He couldn't quite place it, but it felt like recognition. Margareth opened the door, stepping out first before helping the children down. Richard followed, his shoes clicking against the concrete floor, the sound sharp in the quiet underground space. The elevator doors slid open, the warm lighting inside a stark contrast to the cold air outside. The ride up was unbearably tense. Margareth didn't speak. The girl shifted from foot to foot. The boy clutched his mother's coat. Richard simply stared ahead, watching the numbers climb higher and higher until the doors finally opened to the penthouse. The space was vast, with floor-to-ceiling windows that stretched across the living room, offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Everything was sleek, modern, untouched. The air smelled of polished wood and expensive cologne, a world away from where Margareth had been just hours ago. The children hesitated at the threshold. Margaretha's breath hitched slightly as she stepped inside, her eyes scanning the place as if it were foreign, as if she were walking into a life that didn't belong to her. Richard cleared his throat. "I had a room prepared for you and the kids," he said, breaking the silence. "It's down the hall." She nodded stiffly, leading the children forward. The boy reached out, his fingers brushing against the smooth leather of the couch before pulling away, as if afraid he wasn't allowed to touch it. The girl's eyes darted from the kitchen to the towering bookshelves, to the expansive windows that overlooked the city. Richard watched them carefully. He knew nothing about them. He didn't even know their names. He turned back to Margareth. "Do they need anything?" She hesitated before shaking her head. "They'll be fine." Richard didn't believe that. They didn't look fine. They looked exhausted, cautious, as if waiting for something to go wrong. He nodded anyway. "If you change your mind, let me know." Margareth didn't respond. Instead, she led the children toward the hallway, disappearing into the guest room without another word. Richard let out a slow breath. He ran a hand over his face before making his way to the bar, pouring himself a drink. The whiskey burned his throat, but it did nothing to quiet the storm in his mind. He stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, knowing that on the other side was the past he had tried to outrun. But now it was here, and there was no ignoring it anymore. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Then, finally, the guest room door opened again, and Margareth stepped out, pulling the door shut quietly behind her. She didn't look at him at first, just stood there, arms crossed, tension still radiating from her. "I need to know," Richard said before she could speak. Margaretha's jaw tightened. "Know what?" Richard exhaled, setting his glass down on the counter. "Everything." She let out a soft, humorless laugh. "That's a lot to ask." He took a step closer. "I deserve to know." Margaretha's eyes flashed with something unreadable. "Do you?" The silence stretched between them, heavy and unrelenting. Then, finally, she spoke. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Not tonight." Richard studied her, searching for any sign of hesitation, but all he saw was exhaustion, a weariness that settled in her bones. Tomorrow. It wasn't enough. But for now, it would have to be. The night stretched long and restless. Richard remained in the living room, the weight of the situation pressing against him like a storm waiting to break. The whiskey in his glass sat untouched on the counter, the golden liquid catching the dim lighting of the penthouse. He had never been one to drink himself into oblivion, never found comfort in the burn of alcohol when his mind was spinning with unanswered questions. Tonight was no different. He exhaled heavily, running a hand down his face before glancing toward the hallway where Margareth and the kids had disappeared hours ago. He didn't know what he expected. Maybe that she would come out, that she would sit down and give him the answers he craved. But he knew better than that. Margareth had always been stubborn, always held her cards close. If she wasn't ready to talk, he wouldn't get anything from her except walls reinforced by years of hardship. He stood and made his way toward the window, his gaze settling on the endless stretch of city lights below. It was strange how everything down there looked the same as it always had. Cars moving, people living, businesses thriving, while his world had shifted entirely in a matter of days. He had always been able to compartmentalize, to separate emotions from logic, but Margareth's return had unraveled something he hadn't even realized was holding him together. When had he stopped thinking about her? Had he ever? He pushed the thought away and forced himself to get some rest, knowing that tomorrow, the truths he had been searching for would finally start to surface. The morning came with the sound of muffled voices in the kitchen. Richard stirred awake, the faint scent of coffee filtering through the air. He hadn't even realized he had fallen asleep on the couch, his body stiff from an unfamiliar position. He sat up, running a hand through his hair before listening. Margareth's voice. The kids. Small, hesitant words. He stood, stretching before walking toward the kitchen, his footsteps quiet against the polished floors. Margareth was standing by the counter, pouring a cup of coffee, her posture tense even as she focused on the simple task. The girl, Richard still didn't know her name, sat at the small breakfast table, her tiny hands wrapped around a piece of toast, while the boy leaned against Margareth's side, his sleepy eyes barely open. Richard leaned against the doorway, watching. It was a strangely domestic scene, something that should have felt normal but didn't. Nothing about this was normal. Margareth noticed him first. Her body tensed further, but she didn't look away. "You're up early." He glanced at the clock on the wall. "Not really." She turned back to the coffee, not offering more conversation. Richard's gaze flickered to the children, the girl watching him cautiously, the boy peeking at him with the same quiet curiosity he had the night before. There was something there, something familiar that Richard couldn't quite place. "I don't know their names," Richard said suddenly. Margareth paused, her fingers tightening around her coffee mug. She sighed before finally turning to face him. "This is Olivia," she said, nodding toward the girl. "And this is Leo." Olivia and Leo. Richard let the names settle in his mind, his gaze lingering on them longer than he meant to. The way Leo was clinging to Margareth, the way Olivia kept her distance but still watched him with a sharpness beyond her years. It all felt significant in a way he couldn't explain. Margareth must have sensed where his thoughts were going because she spoke again, her voice edged with warning. "Don't." Richard met her gaze. "Don't what?" "You know what." His jaw tightened. He did know. But that didn't mean he was going to let it go. "I want to talk," he said. Margareth exhaled, rubbing her temple before setting her coffee down. "Fine. Let's talk." She gestured toward the living room, and he followed her, leaving the children behind in the kitchen. The air between them was thick with tension, unspoken words pressing against the walls of the space they now shared. Richard sat across from her, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Margareth mirrored his posture, but her arms remained crossed, her body a fortress against whatever was coming. "You said you'd tell me," Richard said, his voice steady. "So tell me." Margareth inhaled deeply, holding the breath before finally speaking. "You want to know why I left?" "Yes." "You want to know why you didn't hear from me?" "Yes." She studied him for a long moment before she finally spoke, her voice quieter now, laced with something heavier than before. "Because I had no choice." Richard frowned. "That's not an answer." Her jaw tightened. "Your father made sure of that." Richard froze. The words hit him like a slap, unexpected and jarring. He shook his head. "What?" Margareth leaned back against the couch, her arms still crossed, her gaze filled with something cold. "You think I disappeared because I wanted to?" Because I just decided to walk away from everything? No, Richard. I was forced out. His stomach twisted. Explain. Margaretha's voice was quieter now, but no less firm. I went up against your father's company. I was young, naive enough to think I could win. She let out a hollow laugh. I thought I was fighting for something good. A case against one of his developments. One that was uprooting families with nowhere else to go. I built a case, had people willing to speak, had momentum. And then, I lost everything. Richard could barely breathe. Margaret continued, her voice unwavering now. My job was gone. Blacklisted. No one would hire me. My apartment lease was suddenly terminated. Everything I had worked for, everything I had built, it was taken from me overnight. She exhaled sharply. I didn't understand at first. I thought it was a coincidence. But then I got the message loud and clear. Richard's hands clenched into fists. What message? She met his gaze, her expression unreadable, that I needed to disappear. The weight of her words settled over him like a crushing force. His father. It made sense. Too much sense. His father had always believed in eliminating obstacles before they became threats, had always played the game with no regard for those caught in the crossfire. Margaret had been collateral damage, and he hadn't even known. He swallowed hard, his voice rough when he finally spoke. I had nothing to do with that. Margaretha's lips pressed into a thin line. I know. That caught him off guard. You do? She nodded, her fingers tightening around her own arms. I didn't believe it at first, but over the years, I realized you weren't the one pulling the strings. She looked away, but that didn't change what happened. Richard's mind raced, the pieces finally falling into place. The reason she had vanished, the reason no one had been able to find her, the reason she had ended up here. His father had destroyed her career, her life, and she had been left to pick up the pieces alone. He leaned back, his hands rubbing against his face. Margaret, she stood abruptly, the conversation over. Now you know. Richard looked up at her, his chest tight with something he couldn't name. But there was still one question left unanswered. Leo, he said suddenly. Margaret flinched, but she didn't turn around. Richard swallowed hard. Is he mine? The silence stretched painfully long before she finally whispered. I told you. You wouldn't like the answers. And then she walked away, leaving Richard alone with a truth that shattered everything. Richard sat in silence long after Margaret had walked away, the weight of her words pressing down on him like an anchor. His father, his own flesh and blood, had torn Margaretha's life apart, had destroyed her career, had pushed her into the shadows without a second thought. And Richard hadn't even known. He had been too busy chasing his own ambitions, too focused on building his empire to notice that someone he once loved had been crushed under the very machine he had been helping to fuel. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands threading through his hair as the realization settled deep into his bones. His father had always been ruthless, but Richard had never thought, had never wanted to believe, that he would go that far. To take everything from someone just because they had dared to stand against him? To leave Margaret with nothing, force her into hiding, erase every opportunity she had fought for? And worst of all, to do it in a way that ensured Richard wouldn't find out until it was too late? Except maybe it wasn't too late. He stood suddenly, his movements sharp, driven by an energy he couldn't contain. He needed to do something. He needed to confront his father, to demand answers, to find some way to fix this. But as soon as he turned, he caught sight of something out of the corner of his eye. Leo. The boy stood just beyond the edge of the hallway, half hidden behind the doorframe, his small hands gripping the fabric of his oversized shirt. His wide brown eyes locked onto Richard, unblinking, unguarded in a way that made Richard's heart tighten. Richard had spent his entire life reading people, knowing when they were hiding something, when they were trying to manipulate, when they wanted something from him. But Leo? Leo just watched. There was no calculation in his expression, no expectation. Just quiet curiosity. Richard cleared his throat, forcing himself to soften his posture. Hey, buddy, he said, his voice quieter than usual. Leo didn't respond right away. His fingers curled tighter around the fabric of his shirt. Then, finally, he took a hesitant step forward. Are you mad? Richard blinked, caught off guard. What? Leo's gaze flickered toward the living room where Margaret had disappeared. Are you mad at my mom? The question shouldn't have hit as hard as it did. Richard let out a slow breath, shaking his head. No, I'm not mad at her. Leo studied him for a long moment, his little face scrunching in concentration. You looked mad. Richard let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no humor in it. I'm mad at someone else. Leo tilted his head. Your dad. Richard stiffened. He wasn't expecting that. Why do you say that? Leo shrugged, as if the answer was obvious. Mom said your dad is a bad man. Richard exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. She's not wrong. Leo seemed to accept that answer, nodding as if he understood something far bigger than a child his age should. Then, after a moment, he hesitated before asking, Are you a bad man too? Richard's chest tightened. It was such a simple question, but it held so much weight, more than Leo probably realized. Richard had spent his life making decisions that benefited him, prioritizing his own goals, ensuring that he never ended up as the one being controlled. He had played the game the way it was meant to be played. But now, looking down at this child, he found himself wondering, had he been blind to the damage left in his wake? Had he become the very thing he had promised himself he never would? He crouched down so he was at eye level with Leo. I don't know, he admitted, but I want to be better. Leo studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if that was a good enough answer. He hesitated before taking another step forward, standing even closer now. You look like me, he said suddenly. Richard's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a revelation. It was just a statement, said so plainly, so innocently, as if Leo himself had already accepted it as fact. Richard swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had seen it from the moment he had laid eyes on the boy. The shape of his face, the color of his hair, the way his eyes were just a shade too familiar. But hearing it out loud, hearing Leo say it so simply, so honestly, made something in Richard crack wide open. Leo, before he could finish, Margaretha's voice cut through the moment. Leo, sweetheart, come here. Richard looked up just as Margaretha appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully composed, though there was something unreadable in her eyes. Leo glanced back at her, then at Richard, before nodding once and turning to go. Richard stood slowly, his gaze locked on Margaretha now. She held his stare for a long moment before finally exhaling. You need to let this go. Richard shook his head. I can't. Margaretha closed her eyes briefly, as if preparing herself for a battle she had hoped to avoid. I knew you'd be like this, she muttered. I knew the moment you found out. You'd dig and push and because I deserved to know. Richard's voice was sharper than he intended, but he couldn't stop himself. I deserve to know if that boy, if Leo, is mine. Margaretha flinched, her lips pressing into a thin line. She glanced toward the hallway, making sure Leo was out of earshot before turning back to him. It doesn't change anything. It changes everything. Margaretha's hands curled into fists at her sides. No, it doesn't. You don't get to come in now and rewrite the past. You don't get to decide that you suddenly want to be involved. Richard took a step closer. I didn't have a choice before. And I didn't have a choice at all, she snapped, her voice low but furious. Do you think this is what I wanted? Do you think I wanted to raise him alone? That I wanted to struggle, to fight for every scrap just to keep him safe? Do you think I wanted to look at him every day and see you, knowing you were out there living your perfect life while She cut herself off, shaking her head. You weren't there, Richard. You didn't know. And now that you do, you think you can just waltz in and fix everything? That's not how this works. Richard's heart pounded. I want to know the truth, Margaretha. She let out a slow, shuddering breath. Then, finally, she met his gaze, her eyes burning with something raw, something fragile and unbreakable all at once. Yes, she whispered. The words slammed into him, knocking the air from his lungs. Yes, Leo was his. Richard had spent years believing that he had left Margaretha in the past, that whatever had existed between them had been buried long ago. But now, standing here, staring into the eyes of the woman he had once loved, he realized something terrifying. The past wasn't behind him. It was right here, staring him in the face. And now, there was no turning back. Richard stood there, motionless, as Margaretha's confession settled between them like a storm that had been brewing for years, waiting for the moment to finally break. His breath felt too shallow, his pulse too fast, his mind racing with the reality he had just been handed. Leo was his son, the boy he had been watching with quiet curiosity, the child who had unknowingly studied him with the same hesitant fascination. He wasn't just some stranger's kid. He wasn't just a part of Margaretha's life. He was Richard's blood, And he had never known. A lifetime of missed moments flashed before his eyes in an instant. The first steps he hadn't seen, the first words he hadn't heard, the birthdays that had passed without him there. He had lost years with Leo, years that he would never get back. The weight of it was suffocating, pressing down on him until he could barely think, barely breathe. Margareth shifted uncomfortably, wrapping her arms around herself as if bracing for whatever came next. She was waiting for his anger, his accusations, his demands. But Richard didn't feel anger. Not at her. He felt something worse, something deeper. Regret. Regret for not knowing, for not seeing, for not fighting harder when she disappeared all those years ago. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. Why didn't you tell me? Margaretha's gaze flickered to the hallway, toward the guest room where Leo and Olivia were, before she let out a slow breath. Because you couldn't have done anything. Richard's jaw tightened. That wasn't your choice to make. Her expression hardened, but there was something else there, too. Something vulnerable, something tired. Wasn't it? She shot back. What was I supposed to do, Richard? Call you? Tell you I was pregnant while I was being erased from my own life? I had no job, no home, no safety, and you. She shook her head, her voice thick with emotion. You were untouchable. You were still in your father's world, whether you saw it or not. And I was barely surviving. Richard clenched his fists at his sides. I would have helped you. She let out a humorless laugh, shaking her head. Would you? Or would your father have made sure that never happened? The words hit harder than he expected. He had spent so long thinking that he was different from his father, that he had distanced himself enough to not be tainted by the man's ruthless ways. But Margaretha's words forced him to see the truth. Back then, he had been part of that world, even if he hadn't realized it. He had been too focused on his own ambitions, too blinded by his own path to see what was happening right in front of him. I didn't know, he admitted, his voice quieter now, more raw. I swear to you, Margareth, I didn't know. She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of deception, any reason not to believe him. But then, finally, she exhaled, the fight draining from her shoulders. I know, she said softly, but it doesn't change what happened. Richard nodded slowly, his throat tight. No, it didn't. But it changed everything moving forward. He ran a hand down his face, trying to steady himself before looking at her again. Does he know? Margareth hesitated. No. Richard inhaled sharply, trying to process that. Leo didn't know. He had spent his whole life believing he didn't have a father, or maybe that his father had abandoned him. That thought made something twist painfully in Richard's chest. I want to be in his life, Richard said firmly. I have to be. Margaretha's expression wavered, but she didn't immediately shut him down. He's just a kid, Richard. He doesn't understand any of this. Then help him understand, Richard pushed. Let me be there. Let me. He stopped, exhaling sharply, running a frustrated hand through his hair. I missed too much already. I don't want to miss anything else. Margareth watched him carefully, her eyes searching his face for something. Maybe sincerity, maybe a reason to trust him. He could see the hesitation, the war she was fighting within herself. This wasn't just about Leo. This was about her, too. About whether she could trust Richard to stay, whether she could open that door and not regret it. Finally, she sighed, rubbing her temple. I don't know how to do this, she admitted, her voice quiet, tired. Richard softened. We figure it out. She swallowed, nodding slightly before glancing toward the hallway again. Not tonight, she said after a moment. I need time. Richard nodded, understanding. Okay. But time wasn't something he was willing to waste anymore. That night, Richard barely slept. He sat in his office, poring over old files, emails, anything that could give him a clearer picture of what had happened all those years ago. He knew his father had pulled the strings to erase Margareth, but he needed to know the full extent of it. He needed proof, something tangible to hold on to, something to confirm just how deep the betrayal had gone. It didn't take long to find. Buried in years of financial reports and legal documents, he found the evidence he had been looking for. A paper trail of bribes, blackmail, and backroom deals orchestrated by his father to ensure that Margareth was left with nothing. Her case had been silenced before it ever had a chance to go public. Her name had been smeared in just the right circles to keep her from getting hired anywhere else. And all of it had been done under the guise of protecting Richard's future. Richard clenched his jaw, his stomach turning. His father had destroyed Margareth not because she was a real threat to his business, but because she had been important to Richard, because she had meant something. And in his father's eyes, that had been enough to warrant her removal. Richard didn't know whether to feel rage or disgust. Maybe both. The next morning, he sat across from Margareth again, this time in the kitchen as she sipped her coffee, her expression guarded. He slid the folder across the table to her, watching as she hesitated before opening it. Her eyes scanned the contents, her fingers tightening around the pages as she read. The more she saw, the more her expression darkened. By the time she reached the last page, her hands were shaking. She set the folder down, exhaling shakily. "I knew he was behind it," she murmured. "But seeing it like this," she swallowed hard. "It's worse than I thought." Richard leaned forward. "I want to make this right." Margareth let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "And how do you plan on doing that?" "I'll make sure you get justice," Richard said firmly. "I'll go after my father. I'll expose him." Margareth stared at him, something unreadable in her expression. "And what do you think that will do?" "It'll make sure he never does this to anyone else." Margareth sighed, shaking her head. "Richard, this isn't a business deal. You can't just fix this with money and power." "I know that," Richard said. "But I can make sure he answers for what he did. I can make sure you never have to live in fear of him again." She looked away, biting her lip, her fingers tapping against the table. "And what about Leo?" Richard's chest tightened. "I want to be in his life," he said again. "And I want to be in yours." Margareth inhaled sharply, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite name. This time, she didn't immediately say no. And that was all the hope he needed. Richard had spent years preparing for moments like this. He had walked into boardrooms filled with men twice his age, men who had built empires before he had even learned how to negotiate his first deal, and he had never once hesitated. He had dismantled companies, bought and sold businesses like they were nothing more than pieces on a chessboard, had taken risks that had paid off in ways no one had expected. And yet, standing in front of the estate where he had spent his childhood, where his father still reigned over everything with an iron grip, he felt something unfamiliar coil in his stomach. This wasn't business. This wasn't just another deal to be made, another problem to be solved with the right amount of pressure or the right number of zeros on a check. This was personal. The air was crisp, the early morning sky a dull gray overhead as he walked up the long stone path toward the front door. The house had always been cold, even when he was a child. A mansion filled with wealth but devoid of warmth. A place where expectations had been laid out like commandments and failure had never been an option. His father had shaped him into the man he was today, but Richard wasn't sure if that had been a gift or a curse. The butler answered the door, the same man who had worked for his father for as long as Richard could remember. There was no surprise on the older man's face, no hesitation as he stepped aside, already knowing why Richard was here. "He's in the study," the butler said simply. Of course he was. His father was nothing if not predictable. Richard stepped inside, the familiar scent of aged wood and expensive cologne filling his lungs as he made his way down the grand hallway. The study door was open, a fire crackling in the fireplace despite the fact that the house was kept at a perfect temperature year-round. His father sat behind his massive mahogany desk, a glass of scotch in one hand, his expression unreadable as he looked up at Richard's arrival. "Son," his father greeted, setting the glass down with a deliberate slowness. "It's been a while." Richard didn't bother with pleasantries. He closed the door behind him and walked straight up to the desk, dropping the folder of evidence onto the polished wood with a sharp thud. "You did this," Richard said, his voice cold, controlled. "You destroyed her life. You took everything from her." His father's gaze flickered to the folder, but he didn't reach for it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying Richard with the same calculating expression he had always worn. "I did what needed to be done." Richard's jaw tightened. "You had no right." His father exhaled slowly, as if he were explaining something to a child. "I protected you. I made sure you weren't weighed down by unnecessary attachments." Unnecessary attachments. Richard's voice sharpened. She was pregnant. That, at least, gave his father pause. A flicker of something passed through his gaze, mild surprise, perhaps, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. "I assumed she would handle it," his father said smoothly, as if discussing a business expense. Clearly, she didn't. Richard felt his stomach turn. He had always known his father was ruthless, had seen firsthand how easily he cast people aside when they no longer served a purpose. But this was something else. You ruined her, Richard said, his voice dangerously low. You left her with nothing. You blacklisted her, made sure she couldn't get a job, took away any chance she had at a future. And for what? Because she fought back? Because she didn't fall in line like everyone else. His father finally picked up the folder, flipping through the documents with the same detached expression he always wore when assessing a situation. She made herself a problem, he said simply. And I eliminated the problem. Richard's hands curled into fists at his sides. She was the mother of your grandchild. His father let out a quiet scoff, setting the folder back down. And what exactly do you want from me, Richard? An apology? Regret? He shook his head. You should be thanking me. I made sure your life wasn't derailed by a woman who had no place in it. Richard felt something snap inside him. You don't get to decide that, he said, his voice quiet but laced with fury. You don't get to decide who matters and who doesn't. His father sighed, as if exhausted by the conversation. I did what was best for you. No, Richard said, shaking his head. You did what was best for you. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to steady his breathing. But you don't control me anymore. And you sure as hell don't control her. His father arched an eyebrow. And what do you plan to do about it? Richard leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk, meeting his father's gaze head-on. I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what you did. His father's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. You think that will hurt me? Richard smirked, but there was no humor in it. I think it'll ruin you. His father studied him for a long moment, the firelight casting sharp shadows across his face. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, as if weighing his options. Careful, son, he said after a beat. You might not like the war you're about to start. Richard straightened. I don't care. For the first time in his life, he truly didn't. He turned on his heel and walked out of the study without another word, his footsteps echoing through the hall as he left the house he had once called home, knowing he would never return. The weight in his chest didn't lessen as he stepped outside, but there was a clarity in his mind that hadn't been there before. He had spent years living in the shadow of his father's empire, years believing that as long as he succeeded, he was free. But now he knew the truth. His freedom had never been real. He had been playing by his father's rules without even realizing it. But that ended today. He had a son, and he wasn't going to let another second pass without fighting for him. By the time he got back to the penthouse, the sun was beginning to set, casting long golden streaks across the windows. He stepped inside, his gaze immediately searching for Margareth. He found her in the kitchen, her back to him as she stood by the sink, lost in thought. She turned when she heard him, her expression guarded. But before she could speak, Richard said the only thing that mattered. I'm done with him, he said. With my father. With his world. With all of it. Margareth studied him carefully, as if trying to determine whether he truly meant it. And what does that mean? Richard took a step closer. It means I choose you. He let out a breath, his voice quieter now. I choose Leo. I choose to be the man I should have been years ago. Margareth swallowed hard, and for the first time, the wall around her seemed to crack. And for the first time in years, Richard felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Richard had never felt so certain of anything in his life. Walking away from his father's world, from the empire he had spent years building, should have been terrifying. Instead, it felt like breathing for the first time. The moment he stepped out of his father's house, he had shed something invisible yet suffocating, the weight of a legacy that had never truly been his to bear. But now, standing in his own home, facing Margareth, he realized that making the decision was only the first step. The real challenge was proving that he meant it. Margareth was watching him, her expression unreadable, her body tense. The words he had spoken still hung between them, settling into the space that had always been filled with hesitation and unspoken regrets. He had told her he chose her. He had told her he chose Leo. But was that enough? Could words undo years of pain, of absence, of wounds that had never properly healed? Margareth exhaled, turning away slightly, bracing herself against the counter. You don't just get to say that and expect me to believe it, Richard. He took a slow step forward. I know. She shook her head, letting out a bitter laugh. You say you're done with your father, done with that life. But what does that even mean? Do you think it just disappears? That he'll let you walk away that easily? Richard clenched his jaw. I don't care what he does. I won't be part of it anymore. Margareth turned to face him, her eyes burning with something close to frustration. And what happens when he retaliates? Because he will, Richard. You know he will. He doesn't lose. He doesn't let people walk away without consequences. Richard took another step forward, closing the distance between them. I don't care about him, he said, his voice steady. I care about you. About Leo. About fixing what I broke. Margareth swallowed hard, her lips pressing into a thin line. You didn't break it, she whispered. Richard frowned. What? She exhaled shakily, her hands gripping the counter behind her. It wasn't you, Richard. It was your father. It was the world he created. But it was never you. Richard felt something inside him twist painfully. He had spent so much time blaming himself, believing that he had been complicit in her suffering simply by not knowing, by not being there. But hearing her say it, hearing her acknowledge that he hadn't been the one to tear her life apart, it should have felt like a relief. Instead, it only made the regret sharper. I should have known, he admitted. I should have fought harder. Margareth studied him for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in her gaze. Would you have? Richard inhaled deeply, considering the question. If she had called him back then, if she had told him the truth before she had disappeared, would he have believed her? Would he have gone against his father? He wanted to say yes. He wanted to believe that the man he had been would have fought for her, would have seen through the lies and manipulation. But the truth was, he wasn't sure. I don't know, he admitted. Margareth let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. At least you're honest. Richard reached out, hesitating only for a second before gently placing a hand on her arm. She stiffened but didn't pull away. I know I can't change the past, he said softly, but I can change what happens next. Margareth looked down at his hand before finally meeting his gaze again. And what happens next, Richard? Richard swallowed. That depends on you. Margareth let out a shaky breath, her guard slipping just slightly. I don't know how to trust you, she admitted. Not after everything. Not after. She cut herself off, glancing toward the hallway where the kids were still asleep. Richard tightened his grip on her arm just slightly, anchoring her to the moment. Then let me prove it to you. Margareth hesitated, searching his face for something. Maybe sincerity, maybe a reason to believe him. Then, slowly, she nodded. One step at a time. Richard nodded. One step at a time. The next few days were strange, a delicate balancing act between the past and the future. Margareth and the kids settled into the penthouse, though there was still an unspoken rule between them that this was temporary. She didn't unpack, didn't make herself at home. Olivia and Leo stayed close to her side, watching Richard cautiously, as if waiting for something to go wrong. Richard, for his part, tried to be patient. He knew this wouldn't be easy. He knew he had to earn their trust, had to show them that he wasn't going anywhere. He spent more time at home, stepping away from his work in a way he never had before. He took the time to get to know Olivia and Leo, to understand their routines, their needs. He learned that Olivia was fiercely protective of her mother, that she had learned at a young age how to be the one to hold things together. He learned that Leo was quieter, more reserved, but when he spoke, he asked questions that made Richard pause, questions that forced him to look at himself in ways he never had before. And slowly, things started to shift. Leo began to seek him out, asking him to reach things that were too high or to help him with a puzzle Margareth had found for him. Olivia stopped watching him like a threat and started watching him like she was trying to figure out if he was worth trusting. Margareth started to let her guard down. Not completely. Not yet. But there were moments, fleeting, but there, where she looked at him not with suspicion, but with something softer. Something that made Richard believe that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't lost everything. But then, the call came. Richard was in his office when his phone buzzed, his father's name flashing across the screen. He stared at it for a long moment before finally answering. You're making a mistake, his father said, his voice as smooth and controlled as always. Richard leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. No, I'm fixing one. His father chuckled, but there was no humor in it. You think this will end well for you? I don't care how it ends for me, Richard said. I care about what's right. There was a beat of silence before his father sighed. You were always too sentimental. Richard smirked. And you were always too heartless. His father exhaled, the sound sharp through the phone. If you think you can go up against me and win, you're more naive than I thought. Richard's jaw tightened. I don't need to win. I just need to make sure you lose. Another pause. Then, finally, his father's voice dropped lower. You're going to regret this. Richard didn't hesitate. No, he said firmly. The only thing I regret is not doing this sooner. He hung up before his father could say anything else, his hands gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he turned, Margareth was standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Was that him? She asked quietly. Richard nodded. Yeah. Margareth swallowed. And Richard stood, walking toward her, his voice steady, unwavering. And I meant what I said. I'm done with him. Margareth searched his face, looking for cracks, for hesitation. But there was none. And this time, when she exhaled, when she nodded, Richard knew that maybe, just maybe, he was finally earning her trust back. Richard had expected a fight. He had spent his entire life preparing for one, knowing that going against his father would never be simple, never be as easy as making a declaration and walking away. His father was a strategist, a man who never took a loss without finding a way to turn it into a win. But for the first time in his life, Richard didn't care about the game, didn't care about winning or losing. He cared about one thing, his son. Margareth had been quiet since his phone call, and he knew that she was waiting, watching, trying to figure out what came next. She had spent years in survival mode, and now, for the first time, someone was offering to fight for her instead of against her. But trust wasn't something that could be earned overnight, and Richard knew that words meant little after everything she had been through. She needed to see action, needed to know that he wasn't just another person who would let her down. Leo and Olivia were in the living room, playing a quiet game on the floor, their voices barely above a whisper. The sight of them, so small in such a large space, made Richard realize just how much of their world had been shaped by instability. They had learned to be cautious, to be quiet, to take up as little space as possible. It made his stomach twist. He watched as Leo looked up, his eyes meeting Richard's for a brief second before darting away. There was still hesitation there, still uncertainty. But there was also something else, curiosity, hope. Richard turned to Margareth, who was leaning against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, watching the children with the same protective gaze she always had. We need to talk, he said. Margareth sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. We've been talking, Richard. Not about this. She turned to look at him fully, her eyes narrowing slightly. What now? Richard exhaled, choosing his words carefully. I don't want this to be temporary. Margaretha's expression barely changed, but he saw the way her fingers twitched against the counter. You mean us staying here? I mean all of it, Richard said, stepping closer. You, the kids, Leo. I don't want this to be some arrangement that expires when the month is up. Margareth let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. Richard, you barely know him. I want to, he said firmly. And I will. But that doesn't change the fact that he's my son. Margaretha's jaw clenched, her shoulders tightening. And what does that mean exactly? Richard exhaled. It means I want to be in his life. I want to help you, help them, give them stability. They deserve that. Margareth shook her head, pressing her fingers to her temple. This is all happening too fast. I get that, Richard said. But this isn't about speed. This is about what's right. And what's right is making sure Leo knows he has a father who wants to be there for him. Margaretha's breath hitched slightly, and for a moment, she looked away. Richard could see the conflict in her, the part of her that wanted to believe him, to trust that he meant what he said. But there was also fear. Fear of what that meant, fear of what it could lead to. She swallowed hard before finally looking at him again. And what happens when this gets hard? Richard frowned. What do you mean? Margareth exhaled slowly. When the reality sets in, when things aren't easy, when he starts asking questions you don't know how to answer. What happens when you get tired of playing house? Because this isn't a game, Richard. This is their life. And I can't afford to have you in it if you're not going to stay. Richard stepped closer, his voice softer now, but no less firm. I'm not leaving. Margareth let out a shaky breath, her eyes searching his for something, some sign that he wasn't just saying what she wanted to hear. I don't know how to believe that. Richard reached out, hesitating for only a second before gently placing a hand over hers. Then let me show you. She stared at their hands for a long moment, then at him, something breaking in her expression, something raw and unguarded. You're really doing this? She whispered. Richard nodded. Yeah, I am. Margareth inhaled sharply, then exhaled. Okay. The word was quiet, barely above a whisper, but it carried more weight than anything else she had said before. Richard squeezed her hand gently before letting go, feeling a shift in the air, something between them settling into place. But there was still more to be done. The next morning, Richard made the call. His attorney answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and alert despite the early hour. "Richard," the man greeted. "What can I do for you?" Richard leaned back in his chair, glancing toward the hallway where Margareth and the kids were still asleep. "I want to establish legal guardianship over my son," he said. "And I want to make sure Margareth and Olivia are taken care of." There was a pause on the other end. "You want full custody?" "No," Richard said quickly. "Margareth is his mother. I just want to make sure that legally, I have a say in his life, and that she never has to worry about stability again." The attorney hesitated before responding. "That's going to take some paperwork. Margareth will need to consent to it." "She will," Richard said. "And I want to set up a trust for both kids. I don't want them ever feeling like they're one step away from losing everything again." The attorney hummed in approval. "I'll get started on the paperwork." Richard hung up, his heart pounding slightly as he exhaled. He had never done anything like this before, never made a decision so permanent, so tied to something outside of himself. But for the first time, he felt like he was doing something real, something that mattered beyond the numbers in his bank account or the deals he closed. Later that afternoon, Margareth sat across from him in the living room, the legal documents spread out on the coffee table between them. She read over them carefully, her fingers trailing over the words as if trying to make sense of them. When she finally looked up at him, there was something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before, something close to trust. "You're really doing this," she said, more to herself than to him. Richard nodded. "Yeah, I am." Margareth exhaled. Then, after a long moment, she reached for the pen. And as she signed her name, something between them shifted, something unspoken but undeniable. Richard hadn't just chosen her. She had finally chosen him too.